On a scorching summer afternoon at Lake Meridian, a disabled black veteran struggling with his own demons watches in horror as a young boy slips beneath the murky waters. Despite his own physical limitations and the painful memories that haunt him, Marcus doesn't hesitate to dive in. What this family discovers about their rescuer years later will restore your faith in humanity and show you that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The prosthetic leg pinched against Marcus Washington's thigh, a constant reminder of the IED that had changed everything 3 years ago in Kandahar. He adjusted the strap for the third time in 10 minutes. Wincing as the August sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered picnic table where he sat. Lake Meridian stretched before him, its surface shimmering like broken glass, reflecting a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Marcus had come here seeking solitude, escape from the suffocating walls of his studio apartment where the silence grew so thick he could barely breathe. The lake had become his sanctuary, the one place where the phantom pain in his missing leg seemed to quiet, where the nightmares of burning Humvees and screaming comrades faded to a manageable whisper. Today, like every Tuesday for the past 8 months, he sat at the far end of the lake where fewer families gathered, where he could watch the water without drawing curious stares or well-meaning but hollow thank dashy dash for dash or dash service comments. The disability checks barely covered rent and groceries. His savings, once earmarked for the house he'd planned to buy with Sarah before she decided she couldn't handle his new reality, now went toward the physical therapy sessions that insurance deemed non-essential. The VA hospital was a 40-minute bus ride each way, and the waiting rooms filled with broken men who wore their invisible wounds like badges of dishonor. Marcus had stopped going 2 months ago, choosing instead to self-medicate with the solitude of the lake and the bottle of bourbon he kept hidden in his kitchen cabinet. He shifted his weight, feeling the familiar ache where titanium met flesh. The prosthetic was top of the line, the VA doctor had assured him, as if advanced technology could somehow restore what had been lost in a split second of fire and shrapnel. Marcus had learned to walk again, to climb stairs, to perform the basic functions of daily life, but nothing could prepare him for the way people looked at him now. Some with pity, others with uncomfortable reverence, as if his sacrifice had somehow elevated him to a status he never wanted and certainly didn't feel he deserved. The lake was different. Today, busier. The annual Riverside Community Festival had drawn families from across the county, and the usually peaceful shoreline buzzed with activity. Colorful tents dotted the grass, their canvas sides fluttering in the humid breeze. The smell of grilled burgers and funnel cakes drifted on the air, mixing with sunscreen and the earthy scent of lake water. Children's laughter echoed across the water, a sound that once brought him joy but now served as another reminder of the life he'd never have. Marcus pulled his baseball cap lower, shading his eyes as he watched a group of kids splash in the designated swimming area. Orange safety buoys marked the boundaries, and 2 teenage lifeguards sat perched on their tall white chairs, occasionally blowing their whistles at particularly rambunctious swimmers. The scene was picture-perfect Americana, families making memories under the summer sun, exactly the kind of life Marcus had fought to protect overseas and could no longer imagine having himself. His attention drifted to a family setting up nearby. The father, a tall man with graying temples and soft hands that suggested office work, struggled with a large beach umbrella while his wife, a petite blonde woman in a sundress, unpacked what seemed like enough supplies for a week-long camping trip. Their son, maybe 8 or 9 years old, bounced impatiently from foot to foot, already wearing his swim trunks and goggles, clearly desperate to get in the water. The boy was small for his age, with the kind of pale skin that would burn easily and a mop of sandy hair that stuck up in all directions. He reminded Marcus of his nephew Tyler, whom he hadn't seen since the funeral for his brother 6 months ago. Family gatherings had become minefields of awkward silences and forced conversations, everyone walking on eggshells around the wounded warrior who used to be the life of every party. "Can I go swimming now, please?" the boy pleaded, his voice carrying across the space between them. Marcus found himself half listening to the family's conversation, a welcome distraction from his own dark thoughts. The mother looked up from organizing sandwiches and juice boxes with the precision of a military operation. "Not yet, sweetie. Daddy needs to finish setting up, and I want to get some sunscreen on you first." "But Mom, the lifeguards are there, and I'm a good swimmer. Remember what Coach Peterson said about my backstroke?" The father finally conquered the umbrella, its red and white striped canvas providing a welcome circle of shade. He was breathing hard from the effort, small beads of sweat visible on his forehead. "Tell you what, buddy. Give us 10 more minutes to get everything set up, and then you can swim for as long as you want. Deal?" The boy's face lit up with the kind of pure joy that Marcus remembered feeling as a child, but couldn't quite access anymore. "Deal, but I'm counting the minutes." Marcus watched as the mother applied sunscreen to her son's shoulders with the methodical care of someone who had clearly been through this routine many times before. The father busied himself with arranging chairs and checking the contents of their cooler. It was such an ordinary scene, the kind of family moment that played out at lakes and beaches across the country every summer weekend, yet Marcus found himself transfixed by their normalcy. The boy's name was Tommy, Marcus learned as he continued to eavesdrop. Tommy Patterson, based on what he overheard of the parents' conversation about swim lessons in school starting soon. The father was David, a regional manager for an insurance company who had taken the day off specifically for this family outing. The mother was Jennifer, a part-time nurse at the county hospital, who had packed enough first aid supplies to handle a small medical emergency. They were the Pattersons, a suburban family from Millbrook Heights, about 20 miles south of the lake. David had grown up coming to Lake Meridian with his own family and wanted to share that tradition with Tommy. Jennifer had been hesitant about the drive and the crowds, preferring their neighborhood pool, but had relented when Tommy begged for weeks to go to the real lake where his friend Jake had caught a fish the size of his arm. Marcus found their ordinary concerns oddly comforting. David worried about Tommy's swimming ability in open water versus the controlled environment of a pool. Jennifer fretted about water quality and the possibility of ear infections. Tommy was simply excited to swim somewhere that didn't have lanes and diving boards, where he could float on his back and look up at the real sky instead of the curved ceiling of the community center. The 10 minutes passed with excruciating slowness for Tommy, who had positioned himself at the edge of their setup, toes in the sand, ready to sprint toward the water the moment he got permission. Marcus watched the boy's barely contained energy with something approaching amusement, the first positive emotion he'd felt in weeks. "Time," Tommy announced. Though Marcus was fairly certain it had only been about 7 minutes. Jennifer checked her watch and smiled. "Close enough. Remember the rules, though. Stay in the swimming area, don't go past the buoys, and check in with us every 15 minutes. Tommy nodded eagerly, already backing toward the water. I know. Can I go now?" David looked toward the lifeguard station, where both guards were alert and scanning the water. "Okay, son. Have fun, but be careful." Tommy whooped and took off running toward the lake, his small form quickly covering the distance between the family's setup and the water's edge. Marcus watched him go, noting the boy's confident stride and the way he adjusted his goggles with practiced ease. He clearly wasn't new to swimming, despite his parents' concerns about the open water environment. The lake was busier now, with more families arriving for the festival activities. The swimming area had filled with children of various ages, their voices creating a constant background chatter, punctuated by the occasional lifeguard whistle. Marcus could see Tommy's bright red swim trunks among the crowd as the boy waded in, his movements careful and deliberate despite his obvious excitement. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to relax, watching the simple pleasure of a child enjoying a summer day. The sun had climbed higher, and the temperature was approaching the kind of oppressive heat that made the lake water feel like salvation. Even from his shaded spot under the trees, Marcus could feel sweat gathering under his prosthetic, adding another layer of discomfort to his already difficult day. He thought about leaving, packing up his small cooler and catching the next bus back to his empty apartment. But something about the scene kept him rooted to his spot. Maybe it was the normalcy of it all, the reminder that life continued to unfold in beautiful, ordinary ways, despite everything that had gone wrong in his own world. Or maybe it was just the simple pleasure of watching someone else's happiness, a vicarious joy that he couldn't quite generate for himself anymore. The Pattersons had settled into their beach chairs, David reading what looked like a work report despite being on vacation, Jennifer keeping one eye on a paperback novel, and the other on the swimming area where Tommy was now fully immersed in play. They were the picture of middle-class contentment, their biggest worry apparently whether their son was having fun and staying safe. Marcus envied them that simplicity, that ability to focus on such manageable concerns. His own worries were vast and shapeless, existential questions about purpose and meaning that had no easy answers. What was the point of surviving when so many better men hadn't? How was he supposed to build a life when the foundation of everything he believed about himself had been blown apart along with his leg? The afternoon stretched on, lazy and warm, the kind of summer day that would be remembered fondly years later. Marcus found his attention drifting between the book he'd brought, but wasn't reading, and the general activity around the lake. Children played in the sand, building elaborate castles that would be washed away by evening. Teenagers clustered in groups, their conversations punctuated by sudden bursts of laughter. Parents dozed in chairs or chatted among themselves, one eye always on their offspring. It was peaceful in a way that Marcus hadn't experienced in months, the kind of ambient human happiness that used to energize him, but now felt foreign and distant. He was an observer now, watching life happen to other people while his own remained frozen in a perpetual state of recovery that never quite arrived. The first sign of trouble was so subtle that Marcus almost missed it. Tommy Patterson had been swimming for nearly an hour, his initial excitement settling into the steady rhythm of a child completely in his element. The lake water, warmed by the August sun, felt like silk against his skin as he practiced the swimming techniques Coach Peterson had taught him during lessons at the community center. He dove beneath the surface, his eyes stinging slightly from the natural minerals, and swam underwater as far as his breath would allow. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus watched the boy's confident movements with growing admiration. Tommy was clearly an accomplished swimmer for his age, moving through the water with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of countless hours of practice. The child alternated between floating on his back, gazing up at the cloudless sky, and swimming lazy laps within the designated area, occasionally calling out to his parents, who waved back from their shaded spot. The lifeguards had changed shifts without incident, the afternoon crew taking over with the same professional vigilance as their morning counterparts. Sarah Chun, a college junior studying exercise physiology, had been working at Lake Meridian for 3 summers and knew the water conditions better than most. Her partner, Miguel Rodriguez, was new this season but had already proven himself capable and alert during the busy festival weekend. The swimming area had reached its peak capacity as families sought relief from the oppressive heat. Bodies moved through the water like colorful fish, children shrieking with delight as they splashed and played water tag. The scene was chaotic but controlled, the kind of organized mayhem that lifeguards were trained to manage. Both Sarah and Miguel swept their eyes across the water in practiced patterns, counting heads and watching for signs of distress. Marcus had begun to understand the rhythm of the place. Every 15 minutes, like clockwork, Tommy would swim over to the shore and check in with his parents, reporting on his underwater discoveries or asking for a drink of water. David would smile and nod, occasionally offering encouragement about Tommy's improving backstroke. Jennifer would insist on reapplying sunscreen, despite Tommy's protests that he'd been underwater most of the time. The Patterson family dynamic fascinated Marcus in ways he couldn't fully explain. Their easy affection for each other, the way they communicated without really needing words, reminded him of his own family before the deployment, before everything became complicated by guilt and loss, and the weight of expectations he couldn't meet. David treated Tommy like a real person, not just a child to be managed, while Jennifer balanced protectiveness with the kind of trust that allowed her son to develop independence. Around 2:30, the festival activities on shore began to ramp up. A local band had set up near the pavilion, their sound check sending waves of distorted guitar across the water. Food vendors were doing steady business as families worked up appetites from swimming and playing volleyball on the sandy beach area. The atmosphere was purely celebratory, the kind of community gathering that politicians love to reference in speeches about American values. Marcus found himself actually relaxing for the first time in months. The combination of warm sunshine, gentle lake breeze, and the ambient happiness of dozens of families enjoying a perfect summer day had worked its way through his usual defenses. He'd even managed to read a few pages of the thriller novel he brought, though he kept getting distracted by the human drama unfolding around him. Tommy had made friends with another boy his age, a freckled redhead named Connor, whose family had set up camp closer to the volleyball courts. The two children had discovered they both attended schools in the same district and shared a passion for Pokemon cards and swimming. They spent the better part of an hour trying to teach each other different diving techniques they'd learned from various coaches and older siblings. The friendship was instantaneous in the way that only childhood relationships could be. Within minutes of meeting, Tommy and Connor were planning elaborate underwater adventures and comparing their abilities to hold their breath. They challenged each other to swimming races, conducted scientific experiments about which objects would float or sink, and engaged in the kind of imaginative play that transformed the ordinary lake into an ocean teeming with sharks and treasure. Marcus watched their interaction with a mixture of nostalgia and pain. He remembered that kind of easy camaraderie from his own childhood, the ability to form deep connections within minutes and throw himself completely into fantastical worlds, limited only by imagination. Military service had taught him different lessons about friendship, bonds forged under pressure, relationships built on mutual dependence and shared danger. This innocent play represented something he'd lost long before the IED took his leg. Jennifer Patterson had struck up a conversation with Connor's mother, a woman named Lisa who worked as a teacher in the neighboring school district. The two mothers found common ground in their shared concerns about screen time and the challenges of raising children in an increasingly digital world. They compared notes on swimming lessons, summer camp options, and the ongoing battle to get their sons to read for pleasure, rather than just completing school assignments. David had abandoned any pretense of working, his laptop closed and forgotten, as he watched Tommy and Connor's aquatic adventures with obvious delight. Marcus could see the man's face soften as he observed his son's joy, the way his shoulders relaxed when he witnessed Tommy's easy confidence in the water. There was pride there, but also relief, the satisfaction of a parent who had successfully shared something meaningful with his child. The afternoon crowd began to shift as some families packed up to beat the traffic home, while others arrived for the evening festival activities that would culminate in a fireworks display over the lake. The composition of swimmers changed accordingly, with some of the younger children leaving and more teenagers and adults entering the water. The energy remained high, but the character of the gathering evolved towards something more mature and less chaotic. Tommy and Connor, oblivious to these adult concerns, had discovered a game that involved diving down to touch the muddy bottom of the lake and bringing up interesting rocks or shells as prizes. They compared their treasures with the intensity of archaeologists examining ancient artifacts, creating elaborate stories about the previous owners of each smooth stone or weathered piece of glass. The game required them to swim slightly deeper than the main play area, though still well within the marked boundaries. Both boys were strong enough swimmers to handle the depth safely, and their mothers had given permission after watching several successful dives. The lifeguards kept a closer eye on their section of the swimming area, but showed no signs of concern about the children's activities. Marcus noticed the subtle shift in lake conditions before anyone else. Years of military training had honed his observational skills to detect changes in the environment that might signal danger. The wind had picked up slightly, creating small wavelets that hadn't been present earlier. More significantly, a steady stream of festival-goers entering and exiting the swimming area had begun to churn up sediment from the lake bottom, reducing visibility in the water. The change was gradual enough that most people didn't notice it happening. Children continued to play, parents maintained their conversations, and lifeguards followed their established routines. But Marcus could see the water becoming cloudier, the clear blue surface taking on a murky brown tinge that would make it harder to spot swimmers beneath the surface. Tommy and Connor were too absorbed in their treasure hunt to pay attention to the changing conditions. They had established a pattern where one would dive while the other waited at the surface, then they would switch roles. Their game had grown more competitive as each tried to dive deeper and bring back more impressive finds than his new friend. Connor went down first on what would be their final dive of the afternoon. He disappeared beneath the surface with the confidence of a child who had been swimming since he could walk, his red hair the last thing visible before he vanished into the increasingly murky water. Tommy waited at the surface, treading water easily while he scanned the area where Connor had gone down. 30 seconds passed. Then 45. Tommy began to look concerned, swimming in small circles and calling Connor's name toward the water. The boy's voice carried across the surface, but in the general noise of the swimming area, it didn't immediately attract adult attention. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Something was wrong. His combat experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and every alarm bell in his head was suddenly screaming. He stood up from his picnic table, his prosthetic leg protesting the sudden movement, and began scanning the water more intently. Sarah Chun, the lifeguard, had noticed Tommy's obvious distress and was blowing her whistle to get the boys' attention. But Tommy was too focused on the water below to hear anything happening on shore. He began diving down himself, coming up a few seconds later without Connor and with genuine panic beginning to show on his young face. "Help!" Tommy finally screamed, his voice cracking with fear. "Connor went down and he's not coming up. Something's wrong." The effect was immediate and electric. Every adult within hearing distance turned toward the swimming area. Sarah was already reaching for her rescue equipment, while Miguel radioed for emergency backup. Parents began calling their own children out of the water, though most weren't clear on exactly what was happening. Lisa, Connor's mother, heard her son's name and rushed toward the water's edge, her face draining of color as she realized what Tommy was trying to tell everyone. David and Jennifer Patterson were right behind her, Jennifer grabbing Tommy as soon as he reached shallow water while David waded in to help with the search. But Marcus was already moving. Despite the screaming pain in his leg where the prosthetic attached, despite the fact that he hadn't been in water deeper than a bathtub since his injury, despite the very real possibility that his artificial limb would make him more liability than help, he was stripping off his shirt and heading for the lake at the fastest pace his damaged body could manage. The water was shockingly cold against his overheated skin. Marcus had forgotten how different lake water felt compared to pools or showers, the living quality of it, the way it seemed to grab at his clothes and pull him deeper with each step. His prosthetic leg created unexpected drag, throwing off his balance and making each movement feel awkward and uncertain, but his arms were still strong. 3 years of physical therapy had actually improved his upper body strength, and muscle memory from his military water survival training kicked in automatically. He began swimming toward the area where Tommy indicated Connor had gone down, fighting against the weight of his artificial leg and the growing certainty that he was probably too late. The murky water made visibility nearly impossible below the surface. Marcus dove down repeatedly, his hands searching blindly through the muddy bottom, feeling for anything that might be a small body. Each time he came up for air, he could see the growing crowd on shore, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles that had already been called, the desperate face of Connor's mother as she watched strangers search for her child. On his 4th dive, Marcus's hand brushed against something soft, fabric. He grabbed blindly and felt the unmistakable shape of a small arm. Connor was unconscious, his body limp and unresponsive, tangled in some kind of underwater debris that had prevented him from surfacing on his own. Getting back to shore with an unconscious child, while managing his own physical limitations, would be the hardest thing Marcus had ever attempted. But as he broke the surface with Connor in his arms, as he heard the collective gasp from the crowd, and saw the lifeguards rushing into the water to help, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since before his injury, the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The weight of Connor's limp body threatened to drag Marcus beneath the surface as he struggled toward shore. Every stroke felt like swimming through molasses, his prosthetic leg creating a constant drag that fought against his forward momentum. The child's red hair floated around his pale face like seaweed, and Marcus could see the bluish tinge around the boy's lips that indicated oxygen deprivation. Sarah Chin reached them first, her rescue board cutting through the water with practiced efficiency. She had grabbed the emergency oxygen kit and was already preparing to begin resuscitation efforts before they even reached dry land. Miguel followed close behind in the rescue kayak, his radio crackling with updates from the EMT crew that was racing toward the lake. "Is he breathing?" Sarah shouted as she helped support Connor's weight, allowing Marcus to focus on staying afloat despite his disability. Marcus pressed his ear close to the child's face, feeling for any sign of air movement. "Nothing I can detect." "How long was he under?" "Maybe 3 minutes total, possibly 4. Sarah's voice was steady but urgent as they maneuvered toward the designated emergency access point on the beach. "That's borderline, but kids are resilient. We need to get him on solid ground immediately." The final 20 yards to shore felt like 20 miles. Marcus's shoulders burned with exhaustion, and the chafing from his prosthetic had become excruciating. But the sound of Connor's mother crying his name from the beach gave him the strength to keep moving. Lisa was being held back by other festival-goers, who understood that she needed to let the professionals work, but her anguish was palpable. As soon as they reached shallow water, several pairs of hands helped lift Connor onto the beach. Sarah immediately began CPR while Miguel cleared the area and continued coordinating with emergency services. Marcus collapsed onto his hands and knees in the sand, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath. "Sir, are you injured?" Paramedic had appeared beside him, her hands already checking his pulse and examining the angry red marks where his prosthetic had rubbed against his skin. Marcus waved her away weakly. "I'm fine, help the boy." But she persisted, recognizing the signs of someone pushing far beyond their physical limits. "You just performed a water rescue with a prosthetic leg. That's not fine by any medical definition. Let me at least check your vitals." The beach had transformed into an organized chaos of emergency response. 2 ambulances sat with their doors open, their red and blue lights painting the sand in alternating colors. The festival activities had ground to a halt as hundreds of people gathered at a respectful distance, watching the drama unfold. Parents held their own children closer, suddenly reminded of how quickly a perfect day could turn into a nightmare. Sarah's CPR efforts were methodical and relentless. 15 chest compressions followed by 2 rescue breaths, the rhythm drilled into her through countless hours of training. Connor's small chest rose and fell artificially with each breath she forced into his lungs, but his body remained frighteningly still. "Come on, buddy," she whispered between compressions. "You've got people here who need you to fight." Jennifer Patterson had wrapped Tommy in a beach towel and was holding him close, both of them watching the resuscitation efforts with wide, frightened eyes. The boy who had been Connor's diving partner was clearly traumatized by witnessing his new friends near drowning, and Jennifer was trying to balance comforting him with her own need to understand what had happened. David stood nearby, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke quietly with someone who seemed to be another family member. His free hand rested protectively on Tommy's shoulder, and Marcus could see the man's face cycling through the same emotions every parent in the crowd was experiencing: relief that it hadn't been their child, guilt about feeling that relief, and the terrible awareness of how quickly tragedy could strike. The paramedic examining Marcus had introduced herself as Alana Rodriguez, Miguel's sister and a veteran EMT with over a decade of experience. She was efficient but gentle as she cleaned the raw spots where his prosthetic had abraded his skin and checked him for signs of water inhalation or exhaustion-related complications. "You're going to need to soak that leg when you get home," she advised, applying antibiotic ointment to the worst of the chafing, "and probably take tomorrow off from any strenuous activity. What you just did was incredibly brave, but also incredibly taxing on your body." Marcus barely heard her. His attention was focused entirely on the small figure lying motionless on the sand 20 feet away. Sarah had been working for nearly 5 minutes now, and Connor still showed no signs of consciousness. Marcus knew enough about drowning to understand that every second without oxygen decreased the boy's chances of full recovery. Then, like a miracle, Connor coughed. It was a small sound, barely audible over the noise of the crowd and emergency equipment, but it sent a wave of relief through everyone on the beach. The child's body convulsed as lake water came up from his lungs, and Sarah quickly turned him onto his side to help clear his airway. "That's it, sweetheart," she encouraged, her professional composure cracking slightly as tears of relief gathered in her eyes. "Get all that water out." Connor's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused but unmistakably alive. His first word was "Mom," delivered in a voice so hoarse it was barely recognizable. Lisa broke free from the people restraining her and fell to her knees beside her son, her hands hovering over him as if she was afraid that touching him might somehow break the spell. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." Her voice shook with the kind of raw emotion that made everyone within earshot remember their own most vulnerable moments as children. "You scared Mommy so much." The lead paramedic, a grizzled veteran named Frank Kowalski, took charge of Connor's medical care with the smooth efficiency of someone who had handled hundreds of similar emergencies. He inserted in 4-line to address potential dehydration and electrolyte imbalances, administered oxygen through a pediatric mask, and began the systematic evaluation that would determine whether Connor needed to be transported to the regional trauma center. Pupils are reactive, pulses strong but rapid, which is normal given the circumstances, Frank reported to his partner while simultaneously reassuring Lisa about her son's condition. "Kid's got good color returning, and his lung sounds are clearing nicely. The fact that he's conscious and responsive is an excellent sign." Marcus watched the medical team work with professional admiration. Their coordination reminded him of his military unit during medical emergencies. The same calm competence, the same ability to function efficiently under pressure, while maintaining compassion for the people they were helping. It was a reminder that heroism came in many forms, not just the dramatic rescue that had brought him to everyone's attention. Dr. Patricia Hendricks arrived on scene as Connor was being prepared for transport to the hospital. She was the festival's volunteer medical coordinator, a retired emergency room physician who had insisted on being present for the large community gathering. Her assessment confirmed Frank's initial evaluation. Connor was stable but needed observation for potential complications from his near-drowning experience. Secondary drowning is our main concern now, Dr. Hendricks explained to Lisa as they walked toward the ambulance. It's rare, but water in the lungs can sometimes cause problems hours after the initial incident. We want to keep Connor under observation for at least 24 hours to make sure his breathing remains clear. Lisa nodded numbly, still holding Connor's hand as they loaded him into the ambulance. The boy was more alert now, asking questions about what had happened and why everyone looked so worried. His mother managed to maintain her composure while explaining that he'd had an accident in the water, but that he was going to be fine. "The man with one leg saved me," Connor said suddenly, his voice still raspy but growing stronger. "He pulled me up from the bottom. Where is he?" All eyes turned toward Marcus, who was still sitting on the sand while Elena finished bandaging his abraded skin. He felt suddenly exposed, uncomfortable with the attention that his rescue had brought. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, piecing together the story of the disabled veteran who had risked his own safety to save a stranger's child. Frank Kowalski approached Marcus with the measured stride of someone who had seen enough heroes to recognize the real thing. "Son, what you did today was extraordinary. I've been doing this job for 22 years, and I've seen plenty of people freeze up when someone else's life was on the line. You didn't hesitate." Marcus shrugged, genuinely uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same thing. "No," Frank said firmly, "not anyone. And certainly not anyone dealing with the challenges you're facing. You saved that boy's life, plain and simple." The Pattersons had been standing nearby during the medical evaluation. Tommy still wrapped in his towel and pressed close to his mother's side. David approached Marcus hesitantly, clearly struggling with how to express his gratitude for what had happened. "I don't know how to thank you," David began, his voice thick with emotion. "Connor is Tommy's new best friend, and seeing him pull him out of the water like that. I can't imagine what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Jennifer stepped forward, her nurse's training allowing her to see past Marcus's discomfort to the physical toll the rescue had taken on him. "You're hurt," she observed, noting the bandages on his leg and the exhaustion in his posture. "Elena did a good job with the immediate care, but you should really have those abrasions looked at by a doctor. Water rescue with a prosthetic creates unique risks for infection and tissue damage." Marcus tried to wave off their concerns, but the adrenaline that had carried him through the emergency was beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that went far beyond physical exhaustion. The emotional impact of the day was catching up with him as well, the first time in 3 years that he had felt truly useful, truly necessary, truly alive. Tommy finally spoke up, his young voice cutting through the adult conversation with the kind of directness that only children could manage. "Are you a real hero, like in the movies?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and Marcus found himself looking into the boy's wide, earnest eyes. It was the kind of innocent inquiry that demanded an honest answer, not the deflection that adults might accept. "I'm just someone who was in the right place at the right time," Marcus replied carefully. "Real heroes are people like the lifeguards and paramedics who train every day to help others. I just did what anyone should do when someone needs help." But Tommy wasn't satisfied with that answer. "My dad says heroes are people who do scary things to help other people, even when they don't have to. You were scared, weren't you? But you helped Connor anyway." The child's perception was uncomfortably accurate. Marcus had been terrified, not just of the physical challenge of the rescue, but of failing, of being too broken to save someone who needed him. The fear had been almost paralyzing, but it had also been oddly clarifying. For the first time since his injury, he had found himself in a situation where his limitations didn't matter as much as his determination. Dr. Hendricks had finished her consultation with the ambulance crew and approached the group clustered around Marcus. Her medical evaluation was quick but thorough, checking his vital signs and examining the treatment Elena had provided for his injuries. "You're going to be sore tomorrow," she warned, "and I strongly recommend following up with your primary care physician about those abrasions. But medically speaking, you handled the physical stress of the rescue remarkably well. Your upper body strength and cardiovascular fitness probably made the difference between success and tragedy." As the ambulance prepared to leave with Connor and Lisa, the boy insisted on being brought over to Marcus one more time. He was sitting up now, the oxygen mask pushed aside so he could speak clearly. "Thank you for saving me," Connor said with the grave formality that children sometimes adopted for important moments. "I was stuck on something underwater and couldn't get free. I was really scared." Marcus felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. "You're very welcome, Connor. Just ... Maybe stick to shallower water for the rest of the summer, okay?" Connor smiled, the first genuine expression of joy he'd shown since being pulled from the lake. "Okay. Will you come visit me in the hospital? I want to tell my dad about how you saved me." The invitation caught Marcus off guard. He hadn't planned on any ongoing connection with the family, hadn't expected his moment of heroism to lead to anything beyond the immediate emergency. But looking at Connor's hopeful face, and seeing the grateful expressions of the other adults around him, Marcus realized that this day had created bonds that couldn't simply be dismissed once the crisis passed. "If your parents think that would be okay," Marcus said, glancing at Lisa, who nodded emphatically. "More than okay," she managed through fresh tears. "We would be honored to have you visit." As the ambulance pulled away, its lights flashing but silent since Connor was stable, the crowd on the beach began to disperse. The festival organizers made announcements about resuming activities, and families slowly returned to their interrupted celebrations. But the group around Marcus seemed reluctant to let the moment end. Elena finished packing her medical supplies and stood to leave, but paused to hand Marcus her business card. "I meant what I said about following up on those injuries. But I also want you to know that what you did today was extraordinary. My brother Miguel has been lifeguarding for 5 years, and he said he's never seen anything like it." David Patterson had been quiet during the medical consultations, but as the immediate crisis passed, he seemed to find his voice again. "I run a regional office for Midwest Insurance," he said, reaching into his wallet for his own business card. "I know that might sound like a strange thing to mention right now, but I want you to know that if you ever need anything at all, I have resources and contacts throughout the area." Jennifer was more direct. "You saved Connor's life, but you also saved that little boy from losing his best friend. And you saved Tommy from a trauma that could have affected him forever. We don't have adequate words for that kind of gift." Marcus found himself holding business cards and contact information from people who had been complete strangers an hour earlier. The connection felt surreal, as if he had wandered into someone else's life story, and was now being invited to stay for the sequel. Tommy had been unusually quiet during the adult conversations, but as his parents began gathering their beach supplies, he approached Marcus one more time. "Will you teach me to be brave like you?" he asked. The question hit Marcus harder than any of the adult gratitude had. He looked down at this small boy who had witnessed something terrifying but was already trying to make sense of it in terms of personal growth and character development. It was the kind of resilience that reminded Marcus why he had joined the military in the first place, to protect the future that children like Tommy represented. "You're already brave," Marcus replied honestly. "You stayed calm when your friend was in trouble, you called for help when you needed it, and you didn't panic even when you couldn't find Connor yourself. That's real courage." As the Patterson family prepared to leave the beach, Jennifer made one final request. "We'd like to stay in touch, if that's all right with you. Not just because of what happened today, but because ... Well, because Tommy seems to have found something in you that he's been looking for. A role model, maybe, or just someone who understands that being brave doesn't mean not being scared." Marcus felt the familiar urge to retreat, to deflect the connection and return to his isolation. But something about the day had changed his perspective on solitude. The bottle of bourbon waiting in his kitchen cabinet suddenly seemed less appealing than the possibility of ongoing human connection. "I'd like that," he heard himself saying. "I'd like that very much." As the sun began to set over Lake Meridian, painting the water in shades of gold and orange, Marcus sat alone on the beach for the first time all day. His prosthetic leg ached, his shoulders burned with exhaustion, and the bandages covering his abraded skin pulled uncomfortably with every movement. But for the first time in 3 years, the pain felt like something other than punishment. It felt like the price of being useful again. The festival continued around him, families enjoying the evening activities and preparing for the fireworks display that would cap off the day's celebrations. Children played in the sand while their parents relaxed in folding chairs, and couples walked hand in hand along the water's edge. It was the same scene that had made Marcus feel so isolated and disconnected when he first arrived that morning. But now it looked different. Now it looked like a community he might actually belong to. 3 days after the rescue at Lake Meridian, Marcus Washington stood outside Riverside General Hospital, clutching a small potted plant and feeling more nervous than he had during his first combat patrol in Afghanistan. The automatic doors whooshed open and closed as people streamed past him, but he couldn't quite force himself to take that first step inside. Hospitals triggered memories he'd rather keep buried. The sterile smell of disinfectant mixed with the underlying odors of fear and pain transported him instantly back to the military medical facility in Germany, where he'd awakened to discover his leg was gone. The steady beeping of monitors, the hushed conversations between doctors who thought patients couldn't hear them, the way hope and despair seemed to occupy the same spaces. It all came flooding back with unexpected intensity. Marcus checked his phone for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. Connor Patterson was in room 314, pediatric wing, according to the text message Lisa had sent that morning. The boy was doing well, she'd reported, eager to see his rescuer and tell everyone about his underwater adventure. The cheerful tone of her message hadn't quite masked the maternal gratitude that still overwhelmed her whenever she spoke about what had happened. A young nurse emerged from the building, her scrubs decorated with cartoon characters that seemed designed to make children smile. She noticed Marcus hovering by the entrance and approached with the kind of professional concern that healthcare workers developed after seeing too many people struggle with hospital visits. "Are you having trouble finding someone?" she asked. "Kindly. I'm heading back inside if you need directions." Marcus gestured toward his prosthetic leg, which was hidden beneath his jeans but clearly affected his gait. "Just taking a moment before I go in. Hospitals and I have a complicated history." Understanding flickered across her face. She'd clearly encountered veterans before, men and women whose relationship with medical facilities had been permanently altered by trauma. "Take all the time you need. But when you're ready, the volunteers at the information desk are wonderful. They'll make sure you get where you're going without any hassle." Her kindness was simple and unassuming, the sort of everyday human decency that Marcus had forgotten existed outside of crisis situations. He thanked her and watched as she disappeared through the automatic doors, her purpose and confidence reminding him that healing happened in places like this, not just hurt. The pediatric wing of Riverside General had been designed with children in mind. Colorful murals depicting underwater scenes covered the walls, complete with smiling dolphins and friendly octopi that transformed the clinical environment into something more welcoming. The nurse's station was lower than in adult units, and the lighting was softer, less harsh than the fluorescent glare Marcus remembered from his own hospitalizations. Room 314 was at the end of a corridor decorated with handprints in rainbow colors, each one bearing a child's name and the year they'd been a patient. It was a celebration of survival and healing that stood in stark contrast to the military medical facilities Marcus knew, where the focus was on rapid treatment and return to duty rather than the emotional needs of the wounded. He knocked softly on the partially open door and heard Connor's voice call out, "Come in." The boy's tone was bright and energetic, completely different from the hoarse whisper Marcus remembered from the beach. Connor was sitting up in bed, surrounded by get well cards, balloons, and what appeared to be half the Pokemon collection available at the hospital gift shop. His color was good, and though he wore a nasal cannula providing supplemental oxygen, he looked like any other 8-year-old except for the hospital gown and the medical equipment monitoring his vital signs. "You came," Connor exclaimed, his face lighting up with genuine joy. "Mom said you might not be able to make it, but I knew you would. Heroes always keep their promises." Lisa Patterson rose from the bedside chair where she'd been reading, and Marcus was struck by how much older she looked than she had at the lake. The stress of the past few days had etched lines around her eyes, and her smile, while genuine, carried the weight of a parent who had come too close to losing her child. "Marcus, thank you so much for coming," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Connor hasn't stopped talking about you since he woke up. The nurses are probably tired of hearing about his brave rescuer." A tall man in a business suit stood near the window, and Lisa quickly made introductions. "This is my husband, Robert. He was traveling for work when everything happened. He flew back as soon as I called." Robert Patterson was a lawyer with a firm downtown, Marcus learned, a man whose usual problems involved contracts and corporate negotiations rather than life-and-death emergencies. His handshake was firm, but Marcus could see the haunted look in his eyes that spoke to every parent's worst nightmare. "I don't know how to adequately thank you," Robert said, his professional composure barely containing the raw emotion underneath. "Lisa told me what you did, but seeing Connor sitting here, talking and laughing... I can't imagine what we would have done if you hadn't been there." Connor had been listening to the adult conversation with the impatience typical of children who wanted to be the center of attention. "Dad, I want to tell him about the treasure I found, the one that got me stuck." The boy reached into a small bag on his bedside table and pulled out a tarnished piece of metal about the size of a quarter. It was clearly old, with edges worn smooth by years underwater, and Marcus could make out what might have been an inscription around the border. "The doctor said I could keep it since it's what saved my life," Connor explained excitedly. "Well, you saved my life, but this is what helped you find me. My foot got caught in some old fishing wire that was wrapped around this thing, and when you grabbed my arm, you must have pulled the wire loose." Marcus examined the object carefully. It appeared to be some sort of medallion or coin, possibly military in origin based on the partial lettering he could make out. The irony wasn't lost on him. A piece of military history had nearly killed Connor, but had also provided the anchor point that allowed Marcus to locate him in the murky water. "Have you figured out what it is?" Marcus asked. Robert leaned forward, his lawyer's curiosity piqued. "We've been researching it online. Based on the partial inscription and the style, we think it might be a military service medal from World War II or Korea. There was an army training facility on the other side of the lake back in the 1940s. The connection sent a chill down Marcus's spine. He'd been rescued by a fellow soldier, in a sense, even if that soldier had been dead for decades. The medal represented service and sacrifice, values that Marcus had been struggling to rediscover in his own life since his injury. "Can I ask you something?" Connor said suddenly, his 8-year-old directness cutting through the adult conversation. "What happened to your leg?" "Tommy Patterson said you have a fake one, but I couldn't tell." "When you saved me, Lisa immediately began to apologize for her son's bluntness, but Marcus waved off her concerns. Children's honesty was refreshing after years of adults who either stared openly or worked too hard to avoid mentioning his disability. "I was a soldier in Afghanistan," Marcus explained simply. "An explosive device damaged my leg so badly that the doctors had to remove it. Now I have an artificial leg that helps me walk." Connor's eyes widened with fascination rather than pity. "Does it hurt? Can you run with it? Is it like being a robot?" The questions were exactly what Marcus would have expected from a curious child, and he found himself smiling for the first time since entering the hospital. "Sometimes it hurts, especially if I wear it too long. I can walk pretty well with it. And I can even swim, as you saw. It's not quite like being a robot, but it is pretty amazing what they can do with technology these days. Were you scared when you jumped in to save me?" Connor asked. "I was really scared when I couldn't get unstuck." The question forced Marcus to confront the truth of that moment at the lake. "Yes, I was scared. I was scared that I wouldn't be fast enough or strong enough, or that my leg would make it impossible for me to help you. But sometimes being brave means doing the right thing even when you're scared." Connor nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness that children brought to important conversations. "My swimming coach says that being afraid of the water makes you a better swimmer because you respect it more. Maybe being scared made you a better rescuer." The wisdom in the child's observation caught Marcus off guard. From the mouths of babes, he thought, remembering his grandmother's favorite saying. Connor had articulated something that Marcus had been struggling to understand about his own experience, that his limitations and fears hadn't disqualified him from heroism. They had informed him. A knock on the door interrupted the conversation, and David Patterson entered carrying a large basket of fruit and wearing a smile that seemed to take years off his appearance. Tommy followed close behind, practically bouncing with excitement at seeing both Connor and Marcus again. "The whole gang's here," David announced cheerfully. "Tommy's been asking to visit every day since we got home from the lake. Jennifer's parking the car. Should be up in a minute." Tommy immediately launched into an animated account of how he'd been telling everyone at day camp about Connor's rescue and Marcus's heroism. The story had clearly grown in the telling, with Marcus now single-handedly fighting off lake monsters and Connor discovering underwater treasure worth millions of dollars. "Tommy," his father warned gently, "remember what we talked about regarding the difference between facts and exciting storytelling." But Connor was delighted with his friend's embellished version of events. "Maybe we really did fight lake monsters. We just couldn't see them because the water was muddy." Marcus found himself laughing at the boys' enthusiasm, their ability to transform a traumatic experience into an adventure story that enhanced rather than diminished their friendship. It was a resilience that he envied and admired in equal measure. Jennifer Patterson arrived a few minutes later, carrying flowers and wearing the slightly harried expression of a mother juggling work, family obligations, and the emotional aftermath of a near tragedy. As a nurse, she immediately began assessing Connor's condition with professional eyes, noting his color, alertness, and general demeanor. "You look wonderful," she told Connor warmly. "Much better than when I saw you on the beach." "How are you?" "Feeling really good," Connor replied honestly. "The doctors say I can probably go home tomorrow if my breathing stays clear. I want to show you the treasure that got me stuck." As Connor repeated his story about the mysterious medallion, Marcus noticed the subtle interactions between the two families. The Pattersons and the Pattersons he'd learned that Connor's family had no relation to. Tommy's, despite sharing a surname, had clearly bonded over their shared experience. They spoke with the easy familiarity of people who had weathered crisis. Together, Dr. Hendricks chose that moment to arrive for her afternoon rounds, her presence immediately commanding attention in the crowded room. She'd been checking on Connor daily since his admission, more from personal interest than professional obligation, since the hospital's pediatric staff had taken over his primary care. "This is quite the gathering," she observed with amusement. "Connor, you seem to have collected quite a fan club." The doctor's examination was thorough but efficient, checking Connor's lung sounds, reviewing his latest chest X-rays, and assessing his overall recovery progress. Her verdict was optimistic. Barring any unexpected complications, Connor would indeed be discharged the following day with instructions for gradual return to normal activities. "Swimming will have to wait a few weeks," Dr. Hendricks warned. "We want to make sure your lungs are completely clear and your stamina is back to normal before you return to the water. But otherwise, you should be able to resume regular childhood activities pretty quickly." Connor's face fell slightly at the swimming restriction, but he perked up when Tommy suggested they could spend the rest of the summer exploring the parts of Lake Meridian that didn't involve going underwater. The boys began planning elaborate expeditions involving hiking trails, fishing from the shore, and building epic SANDCASTL as the afternoon progressed and visiting hours drew to a close. Marcus found himself reluctant to leave. The hospital room had become a gathering place for an extended family he'd never expected to join, a community built around shared experience and mutual care. The loneliness that had defined his life since returning from Afghanistan seemed foreign and unnecessary in this context. Lisa Patterson, Connor's mother, seemed to sense his hesitation. "Marcus, I hope you'll stay in touch with us after Connor comes home. This experience has, well, it's changed our perspective on a lot of things. We'd like you to be part of Connor's life, if you're willing." Robert nodded emphatically. "We've talked about it extensively. Connor nearly lost his life, but he also gained something precious, a hero who showed him what real courage looks like. We don't want that connection to end just because the medical crisis is over." Jennifer Patterson added her own invitation. "Tommy hasn't stopped talking about you either. I think both boys could benefit from having someone like you in their lives. Someone who understands that strength isn't about being perfect or fearless." Marcus felt the familiar urge to deflect, to minimize his role and retreat to the safety of isolation. But looking at Connor's hopeful face and seeing the genuine warmth in the eyes of both families, he realized that his hermit days might finally be coming to an end. "I'd like that very much," he said quietly. "I haven't had much practice at being part of a community lately, but I'm willing to learn." Tommy clapped his hands with delight. "Does this mean you'll come to my birthday party next month? And maybe Connor can come too, if he's all better." The prospect of a children's birthday party would have terrified Marcus a week ago, but now it seemed like exactly the kind of normal, joyful experience he'd been missing. "If your parents don't mind having a slightly broken-down veteran at a concurrence, don't mind having a slightly broken-down veteran at a kid's party, I'd be honored to attend." David Patterson laughed. "Broken down? Marcus, you're the most put-together person I've met in years. You just happened to demonstrate it while performing an underwater rescue that most people wouldn't attempt under perfect conditions." As the families prepared to leave for the evening, Connor made one final request. "Will you come back tomorrow? When I go home? I want to show you my room and my Pokemon cards. And maybe you can meet my dad's dad. Grandpa Joe was in Vietnam, and he's really excited to meet another soldier." The invitation to meet Connor's grandfather added another layer of connection that Marcus hadn't anticipated. The prospect of talking with another veteran, someone who might understand the complex emotions surrounding service and sacrifice, was both appealing and intimidating. "I'll be here," Marcus promised, and meant it. Walking out of the hospital that evening, Marcus felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The automatic doors that had seemed so imposing a few hours earlier now felt like a gateway rather than a barrier. The setting sun painted the parking lot in warm golden light, and for the first time since his injury, Marcus found himself looking forward to tomorrow rather than simply enduring it. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Robert Patterson," it read. "Connor's father. I wanted to give you my contact information and let you know that our family will be forever grateful for what you did. But more than that, I hope this is the beginning of a friendship rather than just the end of an emergency." Marcus saved the contact information and typed back a simple response. "Looking forward to getting to know your family better. See you tomorrow." As he walked toward the bus stop, Marcus realized that the bottle of bourbon waiting in his kitchen cabinet held no appeal whatsoever. For the first time in 3 years, he had something better than alcohol to help him through the evening. The anticipation of belonging somewhere again. 2 weeks after Connor's discharge from the hospital, Marcus found himself standing in the Pattersons' driveway, holding a gift-wrapped package and wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. The house was a modest 2-story colonial in a neighborhood where American flags hung from front porches and children's bicycles lay scattered across well-maintained lawns. It was the kind of place Marcus had once dreamed of calling home, back when such dreams seemed achievable. The sound of laughter drifted from the backyard, where Tommy's 9th birthday party was already in full swing. Marcus could hear the distinctive splash of water balloons and the delighted shrieks of children engaged in some sort of aquatic warfare. The irony wasn't lost on him after everything that had happened at the lake. The birthday celebration still centered around water activities. Connor answered the door before Marcus could ring the bell, his face beaming with excitement despite the slight wheeze that still occasionally affected his breathing. The boy had recovered remarkably well from his near-drowning experience, though Dr. Hendricks had cautioned that full lung capacity might take several more weeks to return completely. "Marcus, you made it!" Connor exclaimed, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the house. "Wait until you see what we set up in the backyard. And Grandpa Joe is here. He's been asking about you all week." The Patterson home was warm and lived in, with family photos covering every available surface, and the comfortable clutter that accumulated in houses where children were encouraged to explore and create. Marcus noticed several new pictures prominently displayed on the mantel shots of Connor in his hospital bed, surrounded by flowers and get-well cards, and one particularly striking image of the boy holding the mysterious medallion that had both nearly killed him and ultimately saved his life. Lisa emerged from the kitchen carrying a platter of sandwiches, her face lighting up when she saw Marcus. She'd taken time off work to oversee Connor's recovery, and the rest had done her good. The stress lines that had been so prominent at the hospital had faded, replaced by the natural warmth that made her such an effective pediatric nurse. "So glad you could make it," she said, setting down the platter to give him a quick hug. "Connor's been counting down the days since we invited you. He's planned out every detail of what he wants to show you." Robert appeared from what Marcus assumed was a home office, looking more relaxed than he had at the hospital. The lawyer had taken several days off following Connor's accident, recognizing that his family needed his presence more than his clients needed his legal expertise. The experience had clearly shifted his priorities in ways that would have lasting impact. "Marcus, welcome to our chaos," Robert said with genuine warmth. "Fair warning, you're about to be adopted by approximately 15 hyperactive children who have heard endless stories about your heroic swimming abilities." The backyard was indeed chaos, but the joyful kind that accompanied successful children's parties. Water balloons littered the grass, a slip and slide stretched across most of the lawn, and a sprinkler system had transformed the space into an aquatic playground. Parents sat in folding chairs around the perimeter, keeping watchful eyes on their offspring while engaging in the kind of casual conversation that built neighborhood communities. Marcus was immediately struck by how normal it all felt. These were regular families dealing with ordinary challenges: work stress, mortgage payments, teenagers who spent too much time on their phones, elderly parents who needed increasing amounts of care. The dramatic rescue at Lake Meridian had been an anomaly in their otherwise predictable lives. which made their willingness to include him in their ongoing story even more meaningful. Tommy bounded over as soon as he spotted Marcus, his birthday excitement amplified by the presence of his hero. The boy was wearing swim trunks and a t-shirt that read, "Birthday Shark," and his face was painted with blue and green stripes that were slowly melting in the summer heat. "You came. Did you bring your swimming leg? We set up a pool in case you wanted to show everyone how you saved Connor." Marcus couldn't help but smile at Tommy's enthusiasm, though the prospect of demonstrating his rescue techniques in front of a crowd of children and parents was somewhat daunting. "I brought regular clothes today, but maybe we can arrange a swimming demonstration another time." An elderly man approached from across the yard, moving with the careful gait of someone whose joints had been worn down by decades of hard work and harder living. He was tall and lean, with steel-gray hair and the kind of deep tan that spoke to years spent outdoors. Most notably, he wore a Vietnam veteran's baseball cap and a t-shirt that identified him as a member of the 1st Cavalry Division. "You must be Marcus," the man said, extending a weathered hand. "I'm Joe Patterson, Connor's grandfather. Been looking forward to meeting you since I heard what you did at the lake." The handshake was firm and lingering, the kind of physical connection that veterans use to communicate respect and recognition. Marcus could see the assessment happening in Joe's eyes, not judgment, but the automatic evaluation that soldiers performed when meeting others who had served in combat. "Thank you for your service," Joe said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what those words meant. "Afghanistan," Connor told me. "Tough war in a tough place." "Thank you for yours," Marcus replied, noting the subtle nod of acknowledgement that passed between them. "Vietnam was no picnic either." Joe's laugh was dry but not bitter. "No, it certainly wasn't. But we survived, and that's what matters. Though I suspect you're still working on figuring out what to do with that survival." The observation was more perceptive than Marcus had expected, delivered with the directness that combat veterans often used when talking among themselves. There was no judgment in Joe's assessment, just recognition of a struggle he'd clearly faced himself decades earlier. "Some days are better than others," Marcus admitted honestly. "That's the truth of it," Joe agreed. "Come on, let me introduce you to some folks. Robert tells me you've been spending too much time alone since you got back. Can't have that. Isolation kills more veterans than enemy fire ever did." As Joe led him around the party, introducing him to neighbors and other family members, Marcus began to understand the network of relationships that had supported the Patterson family through Connor's crisis. There was Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman who had organized meal deliveries during Connor's hospital stay. Tom Rodriguez, a teacher who had arranged for Connor's classmates to make get-well cards. The Williamses, a retired couple who had offered to help with yard work and grocery shopping while the family focused on Connor's recovery. These were ordinary people who had responded to extraordinary circumstances with simple, practical kindness. They had created a support system without formal organization or bureaucratic oversight, motivated by nothing more complicated than neighborly concern and human decency. "This is what community looks like," Joe observed as they watched the children attack a pinata with military precision. "Not the stuff you see on the news, but real people taking care of each other when life gets difficult." Marcus found himself studying the interactions around him with new eyes. He'd been so focused on his own isolation and struggles that he'd forgotten communities like this existed. The casual way parents looked out for each other's children, the automatic inclusion of elderly neighbors in family celebrations, the seamless coordination of party logistics among people who genuinely cared about each other's happiness. It was everything he'd thought he was fighting to protect overseas, and everything he'd convinced himself he could no longer be part of. Connor appeared at his elbow, tugging on his shirt with the persistence that only 8-year-olds could muster. "Marcus, will you come see my room? I have something special to show you." The boy's bedroom was exactly what Marcus would have expected, Pokemon posters covering the walls, Lego constructions occupying every flat surface, and books scattered everywhere in the enthusiastic disorder of a young reader. But what drew his attention immediately was a small shrine of sorts on Connor's desk, centered around the medallion that had nearly cost the boy his life. "I've been researching it online with Dad," Connor explained proudly, picking up a notebook filled with his careful 8-year-old handwriting. "We think it belonged to a soldier named James McKinley who trained at the army base across the lake in 1943. He died in Italy during World War II. The medallion sat in a place of honor next to a printed photograph of a young soldier in uniform, along with copies of military records that Robert had somehow managed to obtain through his legal connections. James McKinley had been 22 years old when he died at Anzio, survived by parents who never learned what had happened to the St. Christopher medal he'd worn throughout his training. Dad says the medal probably fell into the lake during a training exercise," Connor continued. "It stayed there for almost 80 years until it got tangled up in that fishing line. When my foot got caught, it was like James was trying to help me get rescued." The child's interpretation of events was both heartbreaking and profound. In Connor's mind, one soldier had reached across 8 decades to help save his life, creating a connection between past and present that transcended the simple mechanics of drowning and rescue. "What do you think?" Connor asked earnestly. "Do you think James was watching out for me?" Marcus looked at the photograph of the young soldier, noting the determined expression and the hint of fear around the eyes that he recognized from his own military portraits. James McKinley had been someone's son, someone's hope for the future, sent to fight in a war that would consume him before he'd really lived. "I think," Marcus said carefully, "that soldiers have always looked out for each other, even when they're separated by time and distance. If James McKinley's medal helped us find you that day, then maybe that's how these things are supposed to work." Connor beamed at this response, clearly delighted to have his theory validated by an actual soldier. "That's what Grandpa Joe said, too. He thinks maybe that's why you were at the lake that day, because James needed someone to help him save me." The conversation was interrupted by Lisa calling from downstairs that it was time for cake and presents. Connor carefully returned the medallion to its place of honor and led Marcus back to the party, where the assembled children were forming a chaotic circle around a picnic table loaded with birthday cake and gift bags. Tommy's excitement reached fever pitch as he began opening presents, but Marcus noticed that the boy kept glancing in his direction with obvious anticipation. When Tommy finally reached the package Marcus had brought, his hands actually shook as he tore off the wrapping paper. Inside was a compass, not a toy, but a genuine military-grade instrument that Marcus had carried throughout his deployment in Afghanistan. He'd spent weeks deciding on the gift, ultimately choosing something that represented navigation and finding one's way, themes that seemed appropriate for a child whose friendship with Connor had taught him about courage under pressure. "It's a real soldier's compass," Marcus explained as Tommy examined the instrument with reverent attention. "I used it in Afghanistan to help find my way when I was lost or confused. I thought maybe it could help you find your way through whatever adventures you and Connor decide to have." Tommy's reaction was everything Marcus could have hoped for. The boy cradled the compass like a precious treasure, immediately beginning to experiment with its various features while Connor looked over his shoulder with obvious envy. "This is the best present ever," Tommy announced solemnly. "I'm going to use it to navigate when we go exploring at the lake. Connor and I are planning expeditions for when he's allowed to go back in the water." David Patterson approached, clearly moved by his son's reaction to the gift. "Marcus, this is incredibly generous and meaningful. Tommy will treasure this forever." "Every explorer needs a good compass," Marcus replied, watching as Tommy showed the instrument to his grandfather Joe, who immediately launched into stories about land navigation during his own military service. The party continued into the evening, with parents gradually collecting tired children and loading them into minivans, filled with party favors and sugar crash casualties. But a core group remained the extended Patterson families, Joe and Marcus, sitting around the picnic table as the sun set and citronella candles flickered to life. "You know," Robert said thoughtfully, "this whole experience has changed how I think about community and connection. Before Connor's accident, we were friendly with our neighbors but not really close to anyone. Now we have this network of people who feel like family." Jennifer nodded in agreement. "It made me realize how much we were missing by keeping to ourselves. There's something powerful about shared experience, especially when it involves facing something frightening together." Joe took a long sip of his beer before responding. "That's the thing about the crisis. It strips away all the nonsense and shows you what really matters." Marcus here jumped into that lake without thinking about his own limitations or safety because he saw a child in danger. That's the kind of clarity most people never experience unless they absolutely have to. Marcus found himself uncomfortable with being the center of philosophical discussion, but Joe's observation resonated with his own understanding of what had happened that day. The rescue hadn't been a conscious decision so much as an automatic response, driven by instincts and values that had survived his injury and depression. "I've been thinking about going back to school," Marcus said suddenly, surprising himself with the admission. "Maybe studying something that would let me work with veterans or kids who've been through trauma. I'm not sure exactly what yet, but this whole experience has made me realize that feeling useful again is more important than feeling sorry for myself." The declaration was met with enthusiastic support from everyone around the table. Lisa immediately began discussing nursing programs that specialized in trauma recovery, while Robert offered connections at local universities where he served on alumni committees. Joe simply nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had watched a fellow veteran take the first steps toward rebuilding his sense of purpose. As the evening wound down and guests began heading home, Connor made one final request. "Marcus, will you come with us when we go back to Lake Meridian? I want to put some flowers where you found me, for James McKinley. And maybe you could teach me and Tommy how to be better swimmers." The invitation represented a full circle that Marcus hadn't expected when he'd first sought solitude at the lake all those weeks ago. Returning to the scene of the rescue, this time as part of a family celebration, rather than a refuge from loneliness, seemed like exactly the kind of healing gesture he hadn't known he needed. "I'd be honored," Marcus replied, meaning it completely. Walking to his car in the darkness, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that scorching afternoon when Connor Patterson had slipped beneath the murky waters of Lake Meridian. The bottle of bourbon in his kitchen cabinet remained unopened, rendered irrelevant by connections and purpose that satisfied needs alcohol had never really addressed. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Joe Patterson." It read, "Want to grab coffee sometime this week? Think we have more to talk about regarding that transition to civilian life. And maybe we can discuss some volunteer opportunities I know about." Marcus typed back immediately, "I'd like that very much. How about Wednesday morning?" The response came within seconds. "Outstanding. Welcome to the family, soldier." Driving home through the quiet suburban streets, Marcus realized that he was no longer counting the days until his next disability check or calculating how long his savings might last. Instead, he was planning for a future that included education, purpose, and relationships that extended beyond the boundaries of his own struggles. For the first time since his injury, Marcus Washington was thinking about tomorrow not as something to endure, but as something to embrace. 6 months after Connor Patterson's rescue, Marcus Washington stood at the edge of Lake Meridian holding a wreath of white lily and feeling like he was finally home. The autumn air was crisp and clean, a sharp contrast to the oppressive heat of that August afternoon when everything had changed. The lake reflected the brilliant oranges and reds of changing leaves, creating a natural cathedral that seemed perfect for the ceremony they had planned. The Veterans of Foreign Wars post on Elm Street had become Marcus's second home over the past few months, thanks to Joe Patterson's gentle but persistent mentoring. What had started as coffee meetings twice a week had evolved into Marcus volunteering for everything from organizing fundraisers to counseling younger veterans struggling with their own transitions to civilian life. The work gave him purpose in ways he hadn't experienced since his military service, and the camaraderie reminded him that healing happened best in community. "You ready for this?" Joe asked, approaching with his own bouquet of red carnations. The older veteran had become both mentor and father figure to Marcus, sharing hard-won wisdom about surviving guilt, finding meaning after service, and building relationships that could withstand the weight of shared trauma. Marcus nodded, looking across the water to where Connor and Tommy were skipping stones with the focused intensity that only children could bring to such activities. Both boys had grown visibly in the months since the rescue. Connor had regained his full lung capacity and swimming confidence, while Tommy had developed into a natural leader among his classmates, organizing service projects and fundraisers. Inspired by Marcus's example. "More ready than I thought I'd ever be," Marcus replied honestly. "This place used to represent everything I'd lost. Now it feels like where I found myself again." The memorial service for James McKinley had been Connor's idea, but it had evolved into something much larger through the combined efforts of both Patterson families, the VFW Post, and the local historical society. Research had revealed that Private McKinley had indeed trained at the Army facility across the lake in 1943, and his medal had somehow made its way into the water during night training exercises. His family had never recovered his personal effects, and his grave in Italy bore only his name and dates of service. Dr. Patricia Hendricks arrived with a small delegation from the hospital, including several nurses who had cared for Connor during his recovery. The medical team had become invested in the story of the rescue and its aftermath, particularly impressed by how the trauma had strengthened rather than damaged the relationships among everyone involved. "I've been thinking about what happened here," Dr. Hendricks said as she joined Marcus and Joe at the water's edge. "In 30 years of emergency medicine, I've seen plenty of rescues and recoveries, but I've never seen anything quite like the ripple effects from Connor's accident. It's as if saving his life saved several other lives in the process." Marcus understood what she meant. His own transformation had been the most dramatic, but everyone touched by the events at Lake Meridian had changed in meaningful ways. The Patterson families had developed deeper connections with their community. The lifeguards had implemented new safety protocols. Even the lake itself had benefited from increased attention to environmental maintenance and emergency preparedness. Lisa and Robert Patterson arrived with Connor's class from school, 28 third graders who had spent the past month studying World War II and learning about service and sacrifice. Their teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had connected the historical research to current events, helping the children understand how one person's courage could inspire others across generations. Private McKinley would be amazed to know that his medal saved a little boy's life almost 80 years later, Mrs. Rodriguez observed. And I think he'd be equally amazed to see how that rescue brought so many people together. The ceremony began with Connor reading a letter he'd written to James McKinley's family, which had been located through genealogical research and contacted through social media. The soldier's great-niece, now living in Oregon, had expressed overwhelming gratitude that her great-uncle's memory was being honored in such a meaningful way. "Dear Private McKinley's family," Connor read in his clear, serious voice. "My name is Connor Patterson, and I'm 8 years old. Your relative saved my life even though he died before I was born." His medal got tangled up in some fishing line at the bottom of Lake Meridian, and when I got stuck on it while swimming, it helped my rescuer find me in the muddy water. Marcus felt his throat tighten as Connor continued reading, describing The rescue and its aftermath with the kind of honest emotion that only children could express without self-consciousness. The boy's letter captured something essential about the interconnectedness of human experience. The way acts of courage and sacrifice could echo across decades to create new moments of heroism and healing. Tommy stepped forward next, carrying the compass Marcus had given him for his birthday. Over the past months, the boy had used it for neighborhood adventures and camping trips, but today it would serve a more solemn purpose. "Marcus taught me that explorers need good navigation tools," Tommy announced to the gathered crowd. "But he also taught me that the most important direction isn't north or south. It's toward helping other people when they need you." The boy carefully placed the compass next to the wreath they would float on the lake, explaining that he wanted Private McKinley to have a way to guide other people who might need help. The gesture was both touching and profound, a child's understanding of how symbols could carry meaning beyond their practical function. Jennifer Patterson had prepared remarks about the medical aspects of Connor's recovery, focusing on how community support had accelerated his healing in ways that went far beyond clinical treatment. As a nurse, she'd observed countless patients, but Connor's case had taught her new lessons about the connection between emotional well-being and physical recovery. "Healing isn't just about medicine and procedures," she told the assembled group. "It's about feeling valued, supported, and connected to something larger than yourself." Connor healed so quickly because he knew he was part of a story that mattered to many people. David Patterson spoke about the legal research that had uncovered James McKinley's history, describing how modern technology had allowed them to piece together the story of a young soldier whose sacrifice had been largely forgotten until circumstances brought his medal back into the light. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that it had taken a near tragedy to restore honor to a genuine tragedy from 8 decades earlier. Marcus had been dreading his turn to speak, but when the moment came, the words flowed more easily than he'd expected. Standing before this group of people who had become his chosen family, he felt none of the isolation and purposelessness that had defined his life before Connor's rescue. "6 months ago, I came to this lake to hide from the world," he began. "I thought my military service was the only meaningful thing I'd ever do, and losing my leg felt like losing my identity. I was wrong about almost everything." He paused, looking across the faces of people who had welcomed him into their lives, despite his damaged state and difficult moods. "What I learned that day when Connor needed help is that heroism isn't about being perfect or fearless. It's about recognizing when someone needs you and choosing to act despite your own limitations." Marcus went on to describe how the rescue had led to his enrollment in a counseling psychology program at the State University, where he was studying to become a therapist specializing in trauma recovery for veterans and children. The career change had been inspired by his experiences with both communities, and early indications suggested he had a natural talent for helping others navigate their own difficult transitions. "James McKinley never got the chance to come home from his war and build the life he'd planned," Marcus continued. "But his medal helped save Connor's life, and Connor's rescue helped save mine. I think that's how these things are supposed to work, each generation looking out for the next, each person's courage inspiring others to be brave when their moment comes." The formal ceremony concluded with the group walking to the spot where Connor had been pulled from the water. The wreath was gently placed on the lake's surface, its white lily creating a stark contrast against the dark water. Tommy's compass lay nestled among the flowers, its needle pointing toward magnetic north, even as it floated away from shore. Connor had insisted on swimming out to guide the wreath to deeper water, a symbolic gesture that demonstrated his complete recovery from both the physical trauma of near drowning and any psychological fear of the lake. Marcus swam alongside him, no longer self-conscious about his prosthetic leg or the curious stares it sometimes attracted. "Do you think Private McKinley knows what happened?" Connor asked as they treaded water together, watching the wreath drift. Toward the center of the lake. Marcus considered the question seriously, remembering his own moments of desperation in Afghanistan when he'd felt the presence of fallen comrades, providing strength during impossible situations. I think soldiers have a way of looking out for each other across time and distance. If James McKinley's spirit had anything to do with what happened here, I'm sure he's proud of how his medal brought so many people together. As they swam back to shore, Marcus reflected on the complete transformation of his relationship with Lake Meridian. What had once been a place of retreat and isolation had become a symbol of connection and renewal. The water that had nearly claimed Connor's life had also provided the setting for Marcus's return to purpose and community. The afternoon continued with a picnic organized by the VFW Post, featuring stories from other veterans about their own experiences with trauma and recovery. Joe Patterson held court at one table, sharing wisdom about the long process of healing and the importance of finding ways to serve others especially when you felt broken yourself. Dr. Hendricks mingled among the families, observing the interactions with the professional interest of someone who understood that what they were witnessing was a masterclass in community-based healing. The relationships that had formed around Connor's rescue represented everything she'd hoped to see in her years of treating trauma patients, people finding strength and connection and meaning in service to others. As the sun began to set over Lake Meridian, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus found himself sitting on the same picnic table where he'd spent so many lonely afternoons. But now he was surrounded by people who had become family, children who looked up to him as a role model, and fellow veterans who understood both his struggles and his strength. Tommy approached with a carefully wrapped package, his face serious with the importance of his mission. "This is for you," he announced. "Connor and I made it together." Inside was a photograph of the memorial service, professionally framed and inscribed with a simple message: "Heroes help heroes. Thank you for showing us what courage looks like." The image captured the moment when Marcus and Connor had placed the wreath on the water, both of them focused on honoring a soldier they'd never met, but whose sacrifice had connected them across generations. It was a picture that told the complete story of Lake Meridian tragedy transformed into triumph, isolation overcome by community, and the simple truth that healing happened best when people chose to care for each other. As families began packing up their picnic supplies and children reluctantly prepared to leave their aquatic playground, Marcus realized that he was no longer counting days until his next therapy appointment, or calculating how many months his savings might last. Instead, he was planning for a future that included graduate school, meaningful work, and relationships that would sustain him through whatever challenges lay ahead. The bottle of bourbon that had once been his primary companion remained unopened in his kitchen cabinet, now serving as a reminder of how much his life had changed rather than a temptation to escape reality. He had found something better than artificial comfort in the authentic connections and genuine purpose that had emerged from a moment of crisis at Lake Meridian. Walking to his car as twilight settled over the water, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Connor. "Thank you for the best day ever. Can we come back next weekend and practice swimming? I want to get good enough to be a lifeguard someday." Marcus typed back immediately, "Absolutely. Heroes have to stick together." The response came within seconds. "That's what Tommy and I figured. See you soon, Marcus." Driving home through the gathering darkness, Marcus Washington understood that his story was no longer defined by what he'd lost in Afghanistan, but by what he'd found at Lake Meridian. The water that had once represented escape and isolation had become a symbol of connection and renewal, proof that sometimes the greatest rescues happened not in moments of crisis, but in the quiet daily choice to remain open to love, community, and the possibility that broken things could be made whole again. The lake would always be there, reflecting the changing seasons and hosting new generations of families, creating memories under summer skies. And Marcus would be part of that ongoing story, no longer as an observer of other people's happiness, but as an active participant in the complex, beautiful, sometimes difficult work of building a life worth living. Lake Meridian had given him back his sense of purpose. More importantly, it had taught him that heroism wasn't a moment of dramatic action, but a sustained commitment to showing up for the people who needed you, regardless of your own limitations or fears. As he pulled into his driveway, Marcus realized he was already looking forward to tomorrow, not as something to endure, but as another opportunity to practice the kind of everyday courage that made communities stronger and lives more meaningful. The healing waters of Lake Meridian had shown him the way home to himself, and now he was ready to help others find their own path to wholeness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.